everybody, and welcome to the State of Regulation panel. Who is ahead and why in the world of DeFi? We've really got a very exciting panel planned for you today with amazing experts from all over the world. We have Joshua Ellul, the director of the Center for DLT at the University of Malta, and he's also the chairperson of the Malta Digital Innovation Authority. We also have with us Agata Ferreira. She's the expert at the EU Blockchain Observatory and Forum and an advisor for Blockchain for Europe. We also have Toufic Adlouni, co-founder and managing director at Renno & Co., a boutique law firm specializing in emerging technology law. My name is Nerushka Bowan. I'm a director and the head of technology and innovation at Norton Fulbright, South Africa. So I'd just like to give each of our panelists a little opportunity to tell us a little bit about the work that they do and why it's relevant to the discussion today, which is DeFi regulation. Joshua, if we could start with you.
So I'm involved in mainly two activities that are relative. So one is in education, particularly in a multidisciplinary master's in blockchain. And that's important because especially in this space of DeFi, we're talking about legal aspects, financial aspects, and of course, the technical aspects. And then I'm also chair of the Digital Innovation Authority in Malta, which is responsible for providing regulatory frameworks for the technology, which will then be further regulated by the Financial Authority.
Thank you so much. Agata?
Oh, hello. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you very much for having me. As you have mentioned, I am an expert at the expert panel of EU Blockchain Observatory and Forum, and also advisor to Blockchain for Europe. I am also an assistant professor at the Warsaw University of Technology, and I teach and research at several other European academic institutions where I focus on education and advisor work on blockchain innovation in general, on intersection of law and technology. And through my work, I collaborate with the industry members, with policymakers, with other scholars and professors, and we try to develop these policy frameworks for blockchain innovation in general. So this is my focus. And in my some years ago, I worked for over a decade in the financial sector in London as a solicitor, and I worked on structured finance, so always on the edge of what is possible in financial tech, in finance, in law in general. So this is a short introduction from me.
Thank you so much for sharing. Toufic?
Hi, everyone. My name is Toufic. I'm a practicing lawyer for a number of years in blockchain and digital assets. I started out in digital asset and blockchain law before it was cool. So happy to see everyone has come to the party with me as well. Our law firm is headquartered in Montreal, Canada, where we have practicing lawyers in the United States and in France. What we work with primarily in the DeFi space, we work with a couple of interesting clients from a technology standpoint, building out kind of DeFi protocols and ecosystems, from a trading platform standpoint, as well as a trading bot standpoint, allowing people to automatic stake and unstake or create some sort of data aggregation platforms to be able to analyze different DeFi trends. We also work with some other interesting financial institutions like a DeFi bank and whatnot, which is very exciting to see kind of come to fruition. And it's been, that's a bit of a scope of the work that we're doing in DeFi.
Sounds very exciting indeed. So looking forward to what all of you have to share during this discussion. So I'm going to dive right into some of the questions now. For our audience, you are very much welcome to also share your questions in the Q&A box. And towards the end of the session, I will be picking one or two of those to ask the panel as well. So please do share there and your comments in the discussion box as we go along as well. Agata, if I can start with you. I mean, I really think we should, frame the context of this discussion as well. There may be a bit of confusion as regards to cryptocurrency regulation and DeFi regulation. What are we actually talking about? Could you perhaps start us off by maybe sharing a few DeFi use cases and really the differentiation between crypto regulation versus DeFi regulation?
Yes, I think it's important. Thank you for this question, because DeFi is a nascent phenomenon and it lacks agreed definition and clearly defined terminology. So there are indeed many misconceptions and confusions surrounding DeFi. So far, DeFi has been described as many things, as anything from protocol stack to loosely defined collection of ideas and projects. It's been defined as a movement or as an economic paradigm shift. It's not a strict technical term, DeFi. It's not a singular occurrence or any particular project or any particular mechanism or technology. It's rather a multi-dimensional and dynamically evolving phenomenon that is part of this progressive decentralization enabled by blockchain technology. So even though current DeFi applications are still limited to a set of financial applications and products, the catalog of use cases will certainly expand, and the composability characteristics of DeFi allows for limitless future developments and configurations of DeFi applications. So DeFi is a broad concept that describes this emerging area of finance, and the term is often used in misleading way, not always intentionally, to describe a variety of products and applications, and those may be really very different from each other, and some of them may not be decentralized at all and still be called DeFi. And DeFi, there are certain hallmark elements of DeFi that can help to identify what DeFi projects are, and DeFi leverages on main blockchain features. So it's characterized by being open, permissionless, disintermediated, and with no single point of failure. And the spectrum of DeFi is very broad, so the exact degree and mixture of various technological and governance features determine just how decentralized a particular DeFi project is, and whether it is in fact at all a DeFi. So not every application calling itself DeFi is true DeFi application. And DeFi does not refer to one specific thing. It actually signifies the entire emerging ecosystem of composable building blocks of DeFi, financial primitives, underlying blockchain networks, and the whole crypto assets, and the whole community of developers, operators, and participants of all kinds. So from these new fundamentals emerge traditional financial products and services like lending, like borrowing, like derivatives, and more. So DeFi ecosystem has this multi-layer structure comprising various levels of ledgers, assets, gateways, and applications, etc. So when it comes to distinguishing DeFi and cryptocurrencies, it is important to understand DeFi architecture. It's dynamic. It comprises layers that are built on top of one another in this hierarchical manner, facilitating composability and creating various interdependencies. And the bottom layer is the settlement layer, which comprises of blockchain networks like Ethereum, for example, which is a foundational element of DeFi architecture. It is where transactions are settled, verified records of transactions are stored, and the next layer, the asset layer, represents the assets. And this is where cryptocurrencies come in, as these assets can be native to blockchain networks like Ether, or can be other tokens like NFTs or stablecoins. So when it comes to practical use cases, DeFi offers several products which are similar in essence to existing financial services. And due to this flexibility of underlying protocols, novel services and products will certainly be developed in the future. But at the moment, probably lending is currently the leading DeFi product with the players like Maker or Compound or Aave being a popular choice with DeFi participants. Any user in DeFi space can lend their crypto assets to other participants and earn a return. And there are various ways in which lending can be done. Each lending protocol is different. And DeFi gives also opportunity for borrowers for activities like arbitrage, trading, margin trading, or flash loans. Decentralized application is another example of use case of DeFi that enables P2P trading through automated smart contracts. And it does not involve centralized entities or intermediaries, and all trades are performed and settled instantly. And as a result, they are non-custodial, which means that the assets are stored and controlled by users themselves through the use of private wallets and keys. Derivatives is perhaps another one, still minor compared to other DeFi products, but the opportunities for diversification of the crypto asset landscape, hedging, and creating novel and sophisticated instruments are enormous. And there are other currently less prominent products like insurance, asset management protocols, and aggregation tools. So in terms of regulation, it's really important to distinguish the regulations that are targeting cryptocurrencies alone, and regulations that are kind of perhaps are designed to broadly address DeFi space in general, because it is really very broad term and comprises many aspects that involve DeFi space, not only cryptocurrencies.
And I really appreciate that explanation, and I think you've set the scene well for the rest of the discussion and given us just a bit of context, in terms of where this conversation is headed. So thank you so much for that. Toufic, if I can go to you now. I mean, many countries have to date focused very much on crypto assets or cryptocurrency regulations. Could you perhaps give us an overview on that type of regulation? Which countries have really taken the lead when it comes to financial regulation of cryptocurrencies? Could you give us some examples of those jurisdictions? And then further to that, have those same countries made any developments with regards to DeFi regulation?
So I think we can, broadly speaking, put national policy considerations into two buckets. I think there is the first bucket in which the legislature has decided to draft a digital asset specific legislation in which governs the nature of the digital asset space. And the other bucket would be that the legislature has not done any kind of legislative action of the sort and is essentially leaving it up to the regulator, whether the securities regulator or otherwise, to actually produce policy considerations and different types of staff notices and interpretations to set guidelines and rules within the existing framework, which is colloquially called the law of the horses. So I think both ways have positives and negatives on how they can work and not work. However, I would say that as someone who understands the extremely fast-paced and evolving nature of the space, for instance, DeFi in and of itself was something that was quite novel and started appearing in earnest probably in around 2018. There are certain considerations to be done on both ends. So with the current structure, which is taken by, for instance, United States and Canada, in which they essentially state, well, these are the laws, these are our interpretations, and how they essentially apply. With some exceptions, obviously, Canada did amend its anti-money laundering and terrorist financing legislation to incorporate, for instance, virtual currency as a definition and to regulate a virtual currency to virtual currency trade. But having said that, the reason why they essentially have done something of the sort is based upon historical context in which they believe that the market is still extremely novel and want the market to essentially mature to a level in which they feel comfortable when it stabilizes to understand if there will be a specific legislation that needs to be passed or if the existing framework can be applied. The other aspect, I think, is led by maybe a couple of more micronations. I think the standalone, legislation, which I'm very familiar with and I very much adore, is DABA out of Bermuda, which is the Digital Asset Business Act. The Digital Asset Business Act is actually quite a profoundly innovative piece of legislation, I find, and I do definitely commend Bermuda for drafting it, and other nations have now followed suit with a similar version to that. This includes the Cayman Islands, and the BVI is also considering passing legislation on the basis of DABA. And what essentially DABA does is it gives a certain license to any company, really broadly speaking, that is dealing in virtual currency or digital asset space, and creates a very bespoke and case-by-case registration process in which the BMA, the Bermuda Monetary Authority, has certain guidelines in which it is to apply. So this kind of solves the issue with respect to an extremely ever-evolving market, because the way in which the legislation is applied is extremely discretionary and up to the BMA to decide how it is to be applied. So when when DABA was passed in 2018, essentially, like I said, especially for regulators and legislatures, DeFi was not really on the forefront of legislative discussions. But because of the way the legislation was structured, if you do have a DeFi kind of idea or product or something of the sort, you can then kind of produce it to the BMA and receive one of their DABA licenses. Having said that, I think there is going to be maybe a much more broader kind of cultural clash and policy clash that needs to happen within kind of the way we conceptualize regulation. If we take DeFi to its purest sense, which I think I got to explain very eloquently, it is that we are developing these independent protocols that, are able to manage and operate themselves with certain exceptions. And if there is any type of maintenance or guidance, that it's done from a very decentralized and community-based basis. However, the way our legislative history from any act, it's not even to do with securities law or derivatives law, but in any legislative endeavor that we've taken since Parliament has been created, has been very much done based upon responsibility and on the basis of putting someone responsible and actually accountable for certain actions or producing certain obligations on those parties. So it's going to be a very interesting potential change that needs to happen in the future, either that there will need to be some sort of centralization, or centralization will be imposed upon decentralized protocols through court actions and sanctions, which is probably going to be the case. And even in the situation of DABA, if you do want to essentially create some sort of completely decentralized protocol, you would have to still go and have someone who's doing that receive the licenses, etc., and then be kind of the point person responsible for liaising with the BMA. But the other alternative, which is an interesting alternative, which I'm curious to hear everyone's thoughts about, but would be that we develop kind of a new regime that allows for the certain protections that legislation entails us, efficiency in markets and protection of investors, etc., without necessarily compromising on the decentralized part of decentralized finance. So, I think those are certain considerations to be taken into account. And from a United States perspective, like I said, like I had discussed, offline, we do have a court case called Ether Delta, which was in 2018. Not many DeFi court cases out there, but essentially they did hold the developer of decentralized finance protocol liable for the breaches of securities legislation. So that is kind of the precedent setting at this stage, at least in the United States. And I believe from a Canadian standpoint, it would also be a similar decision whenever a DeFi decision comes into the courts, that protocol developers, even if they are completely removed, can be held liable for the protocols in which they develop.
Thank you so much for sharing those insights. Joshua, if I can now switch over to you. I mean, you're coming from Malta. Malta is also seen as kind of a crypto-forward jurisdiction from a regulation perspective. What do you think has the adoption and regulation of cryptocurrencies been in your jurisdiction and jurisdictions who have taken a similar kind of forward-looking approach to these types of regulations? Do you think it's stimulated DeFi development or even DeFi regulation? What are your thoughts on that?
So like Agata said, DeFi includes a whole spectrum of activities from like heavily decentralized DeFi to DeFi that is less heavily decentralized. And really what I would say is regulators, we all started with looking at the traditional crypto, and it's funny that if we could say traditional crypto, but DeFi in general is gaining traction. And it's on regulators' radar. However, the thing is, I think we still haven't come to terms with exactly how to regulate crypto. Now, some DeFi will fall into crypto regulation. It may not adequately provide what is required for DeFi, but you could say that currently some forms of DeFi are being regulated because of the crypto laws. However, there are still many challenges that need to be overcome. Now, when it comes to whether creating a regulatory framework does promote innovation in the space, definitely. So when we regulate the space in Malta, we saw many companies flock here. Also, there's I would say our regulation was really great. It was there. But I would say also that there was a slow process in implementing what was required. And some companies left, but I would say that's pretty normal in all sectors and emerging sectors. But the thing is, yes, we saw lots of innovation in the crypto space, and we're seeing many people now to start to dabble with DeFi. But when it comes to DeFi regulation, there are more issues at play than just creating a crypto regulation. So if you look to other jurisdictions, they may be now, in compared to Malta, they may be more ahead in DeFi regulation. Not that I'm aware of anything, but the thing is that when Malta put in place its regulation, there are many other jurisdictions, European jurisdictions, proposing different types of regulation. And back then, including myself, many were highlighting the need. We need harmonized regulation across Europe, right? And Europe is working on this with the whole MiCA laws and everything else. However, the thing is that now that there's proposed harmonized regulation, we've really put the brakes on, and I imagine this is the same for other European countries. We put the brakes on coming up with new regulation, with exploring how should we regulate DeFi, because we're waiting for the laws to come from Europe. And in hindsight, I'm starting to wonder whether harmonization at such an early stage is now going to potentially not allow for Europe to explore the different possibilities to regulate. And the state still has this luxury because each state can propose its own regulation, and perhaps that is one way to find out what is better regulation to promote the sector. So these are the two different scenarios we're seeing now, where there's still liberty regulation and the brakes on to see what the powers that be, the higher powers that be, propose. But I would say, yes, regulation definitely helps promote the industry because of both legal certainty and consumer protection. However, at the same time, I think a lot of the regulation around the world has always been focused on traditional financial regulation. Let's see how to fit DeFi into our traditional way of regulating. And I think we need to move away from that. We're talking about decentralized technology, decentralized organizations. And we need to come up with a new mindset to see how do we create regulation adequate to host this type of decentralized organization rather than try to fit it into our centralized structures. And similarly, DeFi in and of itself doesn't directly fit into regulation. There needs to be trade-offs to see if we want to fit this into regulation, what can we trade off to fit it in, and does it make sense? So that is what we're currently seeing right now, and my impression is that we're currently, of many different countries are currently struggling with regulating crypto. That it's going to take a while till I hope it's not going to take a while till we see adequate frameworks being proposed. But there has also been some work on creating regulation for decentralized organizations. And there was initial work in Malta as well, which was more academic than ever making it to regulation. And there are some states in America that looked into this. And I think that is actually some good regulation that we can look into to see how to regulate this space, because we are talking about software out there working on its own, undertaking some financial activity. So we need laws adequate to host decentralized organizations. And I think that's a good place to start looking into.
Well, that's interesting you bring that up. Well, I was just going to add that Wyoming did pass a DAO structure, which is being somewhat discussed because it's a DAO LLC. But and I know that the Australian Bar Association had just requested for the regulator to actually create also a DAO entity. As in practicality now, when we're creating decentralized organizations, we are actually using a not-for-profit foundation structure to essentially do that, which is essentially us wedging an old entity into a new structure. But so yeah, I am definitely curious to see how that develops, because we're definitely in line with on
that point, we were working on putting something into place, but we found that we're really agile in getting regulation in place, but there's so many different entities that need to be educated that we said, let's slow down a bit. We have the ideas, but let's slow down a bit.
Well, it's the growing pains, right? For instance, I've been doing work in Bermuda since 2018, and when they first passed the DAO legislation, it was, not to fault them, but it was kind of a mess, right? But that's kind of the way it is when you're passing a completely novel regulatory scheme in which, the whole monetary authority, as well as all players, need to be educated about. That includes the lawyers, the accountants, right? And everyone who creates that ecosystem. But now in 2021, you have, a very well organized and educated and structured regime, as well as authority that manages that regime. And, it is growing pains. Cayman just passed their law in October, and we see similar growing pains as well. But I know it's the cost of being innovative, but over time, I think it pays off.
I think we cannot forget that the traditional financial sector has been built through this incremental long-term process, which was shaped by incremental evolution of the financial sector, technological progress, changing needs and circumstances, and extraordinary events like financial crisis. So the existing design of the traditional financial sector is a result of long-term fine-tuning through diverse processes, compromises between competing interests, market movements, and various policy decisions. And there is no precedent for DeFi, and we are still at the very early development and experimental stage. So far from that kind of maturity, and we should expect this process of developing frameworks for DeFi, as well as standards, codes of conduct, and everything else, to take some time. So this is not something that is unexpected or unusual. This is just the normal kind of process of adapting to new solutions, new technology, and in this case, new financial world, new financial sector.
Agata, if you could just, elaborate on that and perhaps tell us, what aspects of DeFi do you think would actually be subject to regulatory scrutiny? There's potentially such a wide umbrella of things that we're talking about here, but could you perhaps tell us more specifically where you see those potential crossovers that can actually be regulated? I mean, if we look at the focus that cryptocurrency regulation has taken, there's been a lot of focus on things like KYC, your customer, or AML, anti-money laundering types of regulations. First of all, is that even possible with DeFi? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I acknowledge that DeFi space is very challenging for regulators, and Toufic has already mentioned that this is going to be interesting to see that clash, because DeFi is kind of out of sync with existing legal and regulatory frameworks, with governance models that we know, with supervisory mechanisms that we know. So this is a novel space, and lack of legacy in DeFi raises many issues, but also creates unique opportunities. And Joshua has also mentioned we should move away from traditional way of thinking about regulation in this case. You have already mentioned KYC and AML. I think a lot of regulatory efforts will be driven towards that, and will be driven, it's kind of a fear-driven regulation. So addressing the risks, not necessarily appropriately evaluated at all times, but these are the kind of risks that become more apparent. Whereas we still lack certain widely popular regulation or adapted regulation that will be supportive of that space, of DeFi space. And I acknowledge that DeFi creates additional set of risks and challenges, but they result from an early experimental and dynamically developing phase of this space. And there are many potential risks: financial, technical, operational, legal, compliance, and other emerging risks. Let's not forget that DeFi lacks the intermediary layer, and Toufic has already mentioned that this space lacks well-defined and allocated responsibilities and liabilities. So some of the risks are perhaps heightened, but at the same time attempting to apply the same existing rules and mechanisms to DeFi financial space, which emerges from an entirely new financial paradigm, might not be suitable for mitigating the same risks. So the same risk, same principles approach could be applied, but regulatory objectives should be achieved through different, maybe new mechanisms. And here we have transparency and auditability of DeFi protocols, which provide an opportunity for new kind of regulatory scrutiny, insights, and supervision. But we're still a little far from regulators acknowledging that and taking advantage of that. And regulators should know that DeFi protocols are non-custodial, so certain risks related to asset management are either not applicable or mitigated by technology. So legal and regulatory challenges and risks are complex, are still very much underexplored, and traditional legal frameworks are built to suit centralized and intermediated financial space, which are based on jurisdictional boundaries and clearly defined regulatory parameters and mandates. So DeFi space, on the other hand, is decentralized, disintermediated, and borderless, so presents particular challenges for application of legal rules and regulations. So this is a complex issue. This is this paradigm shift that DeFi brings, and it signifies shift in responsibilities, shift in approach, and regulators do face challenge of how to fulfill their regulatory mandate of, for example, consumer protection or risk mitigation without compromising fundamental features of DeFi. Because imposing centralization on DeFi project is in a way defeating the very purpose for which they were created. There are no regulatory precedents, and regulators have to yet develop a consistent and adequate approach. So my high-level recommendation would be to formulate important policy goals and work from that point of view. If there are existing legal and regulatory frameworks and the application to DeFi is unclear or confusing, so it would be important to provide guidance or clarification on such issues who do not stifle innovation. And regulatory guidance on application of existing regulatory frameworks could be also helpful not only to DeFi participants, but to established financial institutions who may be seeking assurances before participating in this new financial innovation. A sandbox would be also beneficial for the industry that could continue to develop with lighter regulatory burden and supervision. And overall, regulators should be, in my view, warned against premature and miscalculated steps. Because at this pace and stage of DeFi development, it's not possible to predict with certainty and accuracy how it will continue to develop. So premeditated and inadequate regulatory response could be harmful to DeFi innovation and even defeat regulatory goals. And regulators should take a broader look at the perceived risks, because some of the risks that existing regulation of traditional finance aims to address stems from centralization and intermediation, which is in general not present in DeFi protocols. So trying to address risks usually arising in traditional financial system with the traditional rules may not be adequate approach. So as Joshua was saying, there is a lot of education that is needed, acknowledgement that some of the risks are shifted through technology. And as an example, for example, set of contractual representations and warranties that would serve to allocate the risks between the counterparties in traditional transaction. In DeFi, this risk is shifted from an enforcement risk to a protocol risk, and that is also a change that regulators should acknowledge. So to start with, certainly KYC and AML will be the first target of regulators, as we can already see at the global level, at the FATF level, and also in the US, some of the proposals that directly will impact DeFi participants. And then from then on, we will see how the regulation will develop.
Thank you so much. I think we are almost towards the end of our session. So I'm going to quickly take one question from the audience, and then we're going straight into closing comments from there. So Joshua, if you could maybe take this question from the audience. What do you think about this? Should regulators themselves be using blockchain-based solutions in order to properly regulate DeFi and other crypto activity? Do we see that as the way forward? Is that a potential solution to overcome these challenges?
Definitely. So what we do is we're a technology regulator that empowers a financial regulator. And if we could have put in blockchain regulation at the initial stages, we would have. But the reality is, to put in technology-based regulation, it's much harder than the more abide by these rules regulation, because you have to support all types of activities. However, in the long term, we hope to get there. And this is really where we want to get to. Why? Because we can achieve regulation through code. Now, if we look at smart contracts, smart contract code will do exactly what it's written to do. And if we prove that the smart contracts are correct, why bother imposing all sorts of stifling regulation when they're doing what they should do? It would be like saying, let's impose some rules to make sure that the sun goes up or that gravity is in place. It is guaranteed to do so. Don't bother wasting your money on that. So I would say in the long term, yes, I would love to see that direction, and I'm an advocate of that direction.
Thanks so much. Toufic, if we could get your kind of views on the regulatory future of DeFi, what would happen in your ideal world? Where do you see, should we even have regulation? That's another angle. Where do you see us headed?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I heard once a funny quote where someone said, if cash was invented today, it would be illegal. And I think we have to kind of keep that in mind when we're looking at different kind of policy considerations in the way forward. But I think the way in which we would need it to do is really potentially create something that works for the industry, right? And we're already seeing potentially flavors of that, but I think it's going to be really interesting for a specific legislation to be produced, in which is what I would say, discretionary enough to allow for the innovation to continue, and also respects the decentralized and autonomous nature of the space without having to impose centralization. I think a great kind of potential halfway solution sometimes is one that we see in the world of data privacy and cybersecurity, where there's this new concept called data trusts, right, where it is essentially a fight against centralization of kind of different organizations that have huge amounts of data that they collect, we can kind of build out these potential trust structures in which, either they can be private entities or public, in which take the role of certain things that we may impose upon a centralized entity, and they actually take that obligation. For instance, we can state that all KYC obligations that would need to happen to actually engage in a decentralized finance protocol would be actually put upon a KYC trust, for instance. And Joshua put it very eloquently, you don't actually need to do any AML tests on smart contracts because it's essentially all there. And to let you guys know, from a very practical standpoint as lawyers, the way we do AML diligence is actually really cumbersome and quite annoying, right? It's like, give us your 3-month bank statements and place comments on every transaction that's over $10,000. Like, how does that actually protect us from anti-money laundering, where there's many ways of actually going about it, whereas on-chain analysis does way more than, someone at a law office kind of going through and getting comments on each line item on a bank statement. So there is a lot of interesting things that I think we can do. And on a final point, I would say it is really our goal as thought leaders and entrepreneurs and practitioners to play a very active role in discussion and engagement with international regulators, so that we make sure that not only our interests are heard, but that the true nature of the ecosystem is heard as well. So I really, call to action to everyone in the crowd is to, reach out to me, or I'm sure Joshua and Agata are on the same page, and let's see what type of entities are out there that actually create these kind of interest groups, or are interest groups in and of themselves, to actually lobby the variety of different players in the space to make sure that our end is heard. I know in Canada we do have a special interest group that I'm part of that lobbies kind of the Ontario and Quebec regulator. But, in Europe there may be other things that I'm not privy to. But yeah, I think that would be the best way for us to act and do something concrete and constructive at this time.
Thank you so much. We are out of time. I'd like to thank again Toufic, Joshua, and Agata for sharing their insights on this panel. Thank you for our audience for your engagement. As all these panels go, they go too quickly, and when we don't really get to all the questions. But I'm hoping that you did receive a lot of insight from this really interesting panel. So thank you, everybody, and goodbye.